Welcome to Beginning JavaScript and jQuery, section 4.1. What is jQuery? As I said at the end of the last video, we are done with JavaScript for this video series. For the next three sections, we will be looking at jQuery and what it is and how it can really make your life a lot easier once you start going with JavaScript. So in this section, we'll be looking at what jQuery is, how we can use jQuery via our local machine, our local server file system, or using a content delivery network. And then we will finish up the section with a basic jQuery example. So let's go ahead and get started with what is jQuery. In this video, we'll be looking at what jQuery is and why we should use it. So first off, what is jQuery? jQuery is a JavaScript library that can make your life a lot easier once you start developing JavaScript. And it is also released under the permissive MIT license. There's probably a good chance that you've heard of jQuery. It's used by a lot of major companies. Microsoft uses it and is actually included with Visual Studio. Companies like Nokia, Samsung, all of them, they, for their websites and stuff, or their web apps, they use jQuery. I'm willing to bet that almost every website you frequent each day probably uses jQuery more than they use traditional JavaScript. And so, what's the features of jQuery? Well, it uses the CSS style element selection for the manipulating the DOM or selecting elements from the DOM. And actually with jQuery, it's a lot easier to do both of those tasks compared to traditional JavaScript, which we'll look at later on. It's got a better event handling system. You can do lots of cool effects and animations with it that you can technically do in JavaScript, but let's say this up front. Anything you can do in jQuery, you can do in JavaScript. However, jQuery is going to be a lot easier. Ajax calls are a lot easier to do with jQuery than they are traditional JavaScript. Asynchronous programming with promises and such, you can do with jQuery. You can parse JSON documents. And it's got some great utilities built into it. And it has older browser support, which we'll talk about here in a moment. So again, why use jQuery? Well, we looked at the features just now, and if that wasn't enough to, really pique your interest on wanting you to use it, then, we'll talk about a little bit more about what it can do for us. As I alluded to previously, it is less code to perform the actions that we normally do. Such as selecting, elements of the DOM or updating the DOM. It's so much easier with jQuery. It allows for greater cross-browser compatibility. Now, what does this mean? Well, JavaScript is, a very cross-browser capable programming language. The problem is that some of the older browsers that you may come across out there with users, they have older Android devices, therefore they're running older versions of Chrome. If they're still there's still some people out there running Windows XP, so they're maybe using older versions of Internet Explorer. With jQuery, what will happen is that if you try to use something that the browser doesn't support, it will attempt to fail back and use the next best thing that it can for that browser. And it will keep doing that until it finally figures out something that it can do to execute the code that you need to use. Ajax requests are a lot less daunting than they, compared to traditional JavaScript. Extensibility. There is, one of the core great things about jQuery is the fact that it has all these plugins that you can use. Plugins that can make forms very easily and, very pretty looking for you. You can, you got these all kinds of different plugins for form validation, you know, that's just, it's endless. What you can think of that you may be able to have to use in JavaScript, you can probably find a jQuery plugin to do it. And with that, you know, there is a very active community, and you know, most of the time that if you look for something online on how to do something in JavaScript, you'll actually find it the jQuery way of doing it instead of the traditional JavaScript way. And, you know, so that kind of comes to the question of why did we spend an hour or so learning traditional JavaScript when, you know, I'm showing you this jQuery now that completely can change the way you just learn things. You know, it all goes back to the old saying of you have to learn how to walk before you can run. So before we can really appreciate and see how we can use jQuery, we had to learn what traditional JavaScript was. So, you know, and, you know, I'm not saying that once you start using jQuery, that's all you will ever use. You will never use traditional JavaScript again. That's not the case. In fact, you know, you'll learn that as you get into more, especially some complex systems, that you really need to have, you know, traditional JavaScript alongside your jQuery and vice versa. So, you know, as we go through these next several videos and you start seeing the power of jQuery, then, you know, it'll help you learn to appreciate the JavaScript language even more.